Welcome to ShockOrama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today we're going to be looking at the 1972 film Frankenstein 80. Frankenstein 80 is the debut and sole feature film directed by Mario Mancini, better known as a cinematographer who worked with the legendary Italian director Mario Bava, and would later go on to work as the cinematographer on the somewhat related film Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all I know about him. This guy doesn't have his own Wikipedia page, and further complicating matters is the fact that there's another Mario Mancini, a former WWE wrestler, who just so happens to also have his own IMDb page. Mancini co-wrote the script for this film alongside Ferdinando de Leone, who... give me just a second... I guess he arguably existed? The only mention of his name that I could find anywhere is in the credits of this film, and there is nothing to be found about him anywhere online. I would go as far as to say that this movie was probably destined to become lost media, if not for the efforts of passionate and dedicated fans of obscure horror movies. Frankenstein 80 likely would have been long forgotten, if not for the presence of cult film stars like Delilah De Lazzaro and Gordon Mitchell, Mario Mancini's work on other cult classics, and the special effects work of future three-time Academy Award winner Carlo Rimbaldi, who would go on to create many of the special effects seen in the movies Alien and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. I was able to find that Mancini and De Leone were allegedly inspired by the Italian adult comic series Oltretomba. This is one of the only covers that I could find that was safe for YouTube, as many of the others are filled to the brim with nudity and gore. And as a first for this channel, I'd actually like to give a content warning here. There was a fair amount of violence and gore in my last video covering Dracula vs. Frankenstein. However, I feel that it was still pretty campy and cheesy. Frankenstein 80 and the next movie I'll be covering after this both feature more intense levels of violence and gore, particularly in their scenes of violence against women. I feel that some of these scenes cross boundaries in ways that can be triggering to some people, and I'd just like to put a warning out there for anyone who's interested in watching these movies on your own, just what it is you're getting into. And without further ado, I now present to you Frankenstein 80. The movie starts with a one-handed man listening to the radio as he drives. The radio program is talking about a new serum developed by Dr. Schwartz that will prevent organ transplant patients from having the new organs get rejected by their bodies. We cut to a woman walking through a dark alleyway at night. A figure wearing a black trench coat and making really gross mouth noises and breathing sounds attacks her and kills her, then rips open her shirt and uses a scalpel to remove an organ from her body. This is the first instance where we're going to get to see just how gross this movie is going to be, since they used actual animal parts for a lot of the gore here. The figure walks towards the camera, and we see blood dripping from his hands as a title card comes up, and we get to hear some of the groovy soundtrack. The score was composed by Daniel Petrucci, who composed numerous soundtracks for Italian films throughout the 70s and 80s. After the credits, the woman's body is discovered with a great horror movie scream. And then we cut again to see that the one-handed man has crashed his car and is in critical condition. The paramedics say that they're going to take him straight to Dr. Schwartz, since that's his only chance for survival. Back at the murder scene, the police have now arrived, and Inspector Schneider finds a bloody scalpel by the corpse. Next, we're introduced to Carl and his sister. Carl is a journalist with a local newspaper, and his sister is suffering from some unspecified but deadly illness which will require her to get an organ transplant. Carl tells his sister he's confident that Dr. Schwartz's serum is going to ensure her full recovery. Dr. Schwartz himself comes in and happily announces that an organ donor has been found. Gee, I wonder who that could be. Oh, it's the one-handed man from the car crash. He just died off screen. That's kind of sad. Dr. Schwartz brings Carl into his office, where he's just keeping the serum in a mini-fridge. And this is the only sample of it in existence. And he also hasn't recorded any notes on how to make it. God, this guy's just begging for something bad to happen. Sure enough, later that night, a mysterious figure wearing black leather gloves unlocks his office and steals the serum. I mentioned at the end of the Dracula vs. Frankenstein video that this movie was a Giallo-inspired take on the Frankenstein story, and this is what I mean by that. Giallo was a genre of Italian movies and novels centered around hyper-violent, hyper-gory crime stories, which often featured a mysterious killer wearing a black trench coat, black hat, and black leather gloves. Giallo movies often had a bizarre dream logic quality to the plot lines, which can be a turnoff for some people, but personally I love it. In the future, I'm planning on making a longer video dedicated to exploring the history of the genre and showcasing a couple of my favorite films. But for now, I just wanted to let you know what I mean when I say that this movie borrows a lot of Giallo aesthetics. Carl's sister is wheeled into the operating room, and this is the absolute last thing I would want to see before going under anesthesia. Also, I guess this means that no one bothered to grab the Schwartz serum until after they had already started the surgery. This is the least organized hospital I've ever seen. 1 out of 5 stars. Do not recommend. In a different room in the hospital, we see a blonde doctor removing several organs from the body of the one-handed man. Even in death, this poor guy just can't catch a break. The doctor puts the organs into jars of formaldehyde and then takes them to a secret room hidden behind a bookcase in his office. There, he puts them in a refrigerator, right next to the Schwartz serum. Next morning, Dr. Schwartz and Carl are meeting in his office. Dr. Schwartz is somewhat upset because someone stole his serum, and Carl is extremely upset because his sister died on the operating table. Schwartz agrees to let Carl harass anyone he wants to at the hospital in order to find his serum. Carl tries questioning a couple of the hospital workers, and they keep sending him to go bother someone else until finally he finds Fritz, Dr. Schwartz's assistant, and the only other person known to have access to his office. Fritz has no idea who could have stolen the serum, but he mentions that he did smell formaldehyde in Schwartz's office after the theft. That night, a large man in a trench coat and hat with a horribly scarred and stitched up face is standing outside a butcher's shop. He follows the woman working behind the counter into the walk-in freezer, and there he murders her by beating her to death with a large bone in a brutally surreal sequence. At the police station, Inspector Schneider is busy berating one of his assistants for misspelling his name in a statement for the newspapers.
What idiot typed this report?
The idiot's me.
That was a rhetorical question.
2 detectives come in and report that they still haven't learned much about the murder from the opening credits, and Schneider decides that no one is allowed to smoke until they've caught the killer. We cut again to the blonde doctor, and this is obviously our Dr. Frankenstein for this movie. He's preparing to perform another organ transplant on his monster, the stitched-up man from the butcher's shop and from the opening credits. One thing I like about this movie is that the monster actually has a name, Mosaic. We learn from a cassette tape that Frankenstein plays that he's been performing a series of organ transplants on Mosaic to keep him alive, since his body keeps rejecting new organs after only a couple days. Frankenstein begins his surgery, and we get possibly the only scene in all of cinema of a testicle transplant. I don't know if this is something the filmmakers should be proud of or not, but I thought I'd mention it just the same. Outside, Carl starts ringing a doorbell, which causes a buzzer to go off in Frankenstein's lab. No one answers, so Carl goes next door to Frankenstein's house and tries knocking. The geography of this location always confuses me, since we saw that Frankenstein's secret lab is located inside his office at the hospital, so does this mean that Frankenstein's house is right next door to the hospital? And then why is there a doorbell and entrance to the secret lab from outside that anyone can see and walk up to? I guess we'll never get any answers. The door is answered by Frankenstein's daughter, Sonia, who is played by Delilah DeLazzaro, who was credited as Delilah Parker for some reason. DeLazzaro has an absolutely fascinating life story, having gotten married and having a child at the age of 15, and then starting her modeling career with the help of her mother-in-law before separating from her husband. She moved to Rome to continue her modeling career, and then began auditioning for film roles after some encouragement from a friend. One of her first film roles was in the 1972 film The Scapone Game, where she played the nurse for Bette Davis's character. She and Bette Davis became friends during filming, despite the language barrier between them, and she retired from acting in 2015. I'll have even more information about her and her career in the next video, which is covering another movie that she starred in. Sonia explains that Dr. Frankenstein isn't home right now, so Carl goes back to his car. There, he's approached by a blonde sex worker, but he's a lot more interested in Sonia right now, so he just drives off. Later that night, Mosaic approaches a group of sex workers in what appears to be the same spot. Where the hell does Frankenstein live? He's in a house that's right next to the hospital, but there's also a bunch of ladies of the night working right outside? What is happening? Where are we? Mosaic tries approaching the same blonde woman who approached Carl earlier, but she's freaked out by his appearance and runs away. A different woman seems to be into him, though, and she takes him to a nearby motel room.
You may have a limp when you walk, but I bet you don't have one in bed.
The woman isn't as into it as she first thought, though. When she sees Mosaic undressed, she screams, and he attacks and strangles her to death. During all of this, Dr. Frankenstein has discovered that Mosaic escaped from the lab again and has been looking for him. He makes it into the room and quickly dresses Mosaic before rushing him out the door. The next morning, the police are on the scene. We see one puzzled-looking detective sniffing the air. Back at the police station, Inspector Schneider is being informed that the scalpel found at the first murder scene has 2 different sets of fingerprints on it, which would make no sense for a normal murder case. These very same 2 sets of fingerprints were found in the sex worker's room that they had just investigated. Schneider is enraged by this nonsensical evidence. He's even more enraged when he reads the newspaper and sees the media has been reporting on the killings and, presumably, the police's lack of progress in the investigation. I'm just guessing on that last part, though, because it appears that the newspaper is written in German, which I can't read. At his own office, Carl is dictating his thoughts on the case into a tape recorder. An assistant comes in to deliver a telegram, and Carl decides he's going to ruin this man's whole day, and forces him to sit down and listen while he rambles on about the gruesome killings. Carl suddenly gets an idea and decides to rush out of the room to go talk to the police about it. I just feel so bad for his poor assistant. At the police station, Carl forces his way into Inspector Schneider's office and sits down to talk to him. I also couldn't help but notice these 2 detectives standing outside talking about the murder cases, and they're very clearly more concerned with being able to smoke again.
But if he doesn't get this solved, nobody's gonna smoke.
Good job, guys. Carl asks Schneider if anyone smelled formaldehyde in the sex worker's room, and reveals what Fritz had told him about smelling formaldehyde in Dr. Schwartz's office. This information is apparently enough to change Schneider's whole mind on journalists, and they're best buds now. Carl goes back to Frankenstein's house to try talking with him, but again is greeted by Sonia at the door, telling him the doctor is away. He isn't too bothered by this, since he likes Sonia, so he sits down inside and tries flirting with her.
Oh, yes, I like children very much. And do you like reporters?
Okay, Jesus Christ, dude. Let's just stick to talking about the murder case then. At the hospital, Schwartz is confronting Frankenstein in his office. He tells Frankenstein that the scalpel found at the first murder scene was assigned to his office, implying that Frankenstein may know more about the murders than he's letting on. Frankenstein feigns ignorance at first, but they're interrupted by a loud crashing sound coming from behind the bookcase. Frankenstein just straight up admits that he has his own secret laboratory and then lets Schwartz in. Inside, Mosaic is moaning and writhing in pain. While Dr. Schwartz is distracted, Frankenstein comes up behind him and slits his throat with a scalpel, and then he gives Mosaic a sedative.
Oh, Tim! Sedative!
On the nosy!
This turns into yet another gory surgery scene, where Frankenstein removes Schwartz's eyes and transplants them into Mosaic's head. He also mentions that Schwartz's eyes are slightly too large for Mosaic's eye sockets, which, that's gotta be so uncomfortable. Once again, the special effects work really well in this movie, and I wish I could have found any behind-the-scenes info on how they were created. After the surgery, Frankenstein takes the cassette with all his dictated surgical notes and leaves it in an unlocked drawer in his desk where anyone could find it. What the hell are you doing, dude? Are you trying to get caught? Fritz comes in and asks Frankenstein where Dr. Schwartz just went, but Frankenstein deflects him by pretending Schwartz never entered his office. That night, he instructs Mosaic to kill Fritz since he's becoming too suspicious. Because what's less suspicious than one missing doctor? 2 missing doctors, apparently. Carl is snooping around in the hospital that night because no one cares about things like security or patient privacy in this city. In an operating room, he finds a headless corpse with an unusual birthmark on its chest. In another part of the hospital, Mosaic sneaks up behind Fritz and knocks him out with some chloroform. Somehow never running into Mosaic dragging Fritz through the hallways, Carl enters Frankenstein's office and almost immediately finds the cassette tape hidden in the drawer. See, I told you that was a stupid place to hide it. As Carl leaves the hospital, he finds the police outside in a frenzy. Inspector Schneider explains that they're investigating the disappearances of Dr. Schwartz and Fritz, and that apparently a patient had actually seen a large man dragging away Fritz. Did Frankenstein just, forget that there are other people in hospitals besides the doctors? Did he forget what a hospital is? Actually, the more I think about it, that's pretty in character for him. I think that's canon. Carl asks Inspector Schneider to come with him to pay Frankenstein a visit. They're greeted at the door once again by Sonia, who invites them inside to wait for the doctor to get back. Frankenstein is completing a blood transfusion for Mosaic, using Fritz as the unwilling donor/murder victim. But he does manage to finish in time to make an appearance at his house and talk with Carl and Schneider. They ask him if he knows anything about Fritz and Schwartz's disappearances, but Frankenstein says he didn't even know they were missing since he was working late at the hospital that night. Carl and Schneider are all like, "Damn, this guy's good. Well, I guess there's nothing else we can do here." So they just leave. But once they're outside, Carl reveals that he knows that Frankenstein is a dirty liar, because he was just at the hospital and Frankenstein was not in his office. Schneider naturally asks just what the hell Carl was doing snooping around in the hospital, to which Carl responds, "Oh, stuff." And then he just runs off.
Please tell me what you're driving at.
I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I'll call you later.
Nailed it. Back at his own office, Carl finally gets around to listening to Frankenstein's tape, and he is impressed by Frankenstein's genius. Like, okay, I guess, yes, it is very impressive what he was able to accomplish, but isn't it also kind of horrifying that the murderer is actually an abomination made out of the stolen body parts from his own murder victims? No? Just me? Okay, then. I love this moment where Carl tries to get his assistant to sit down and listen to him ramble again, and the assistant is just like, "Hell no, you're weird."
Thank you. Now sit down there.
Oh no, no more horror stories for me.
However, the assistant did leave some proofs for the next day's paper with Carl, and Carl notices something interesting in them. There's a description for the missing Dr. Schwartz that includes that he has a distinctive strawberry birthmark on his chest, just like the headless corpse that he'd found at the hospital earlier. Carl knows two things. One, the headless corpse is Dr. Schwartz. And two, the police will do anything he says. He controls the police now. He phones up his buddy, Inspector Schneider, and has him and what appears to be the entire police force meet him at the hospital. They waste no time beginning their investigation, immediately going to confirm the identity of the headless body. Carl goes to have another look in Frankenstein's office, and there he finds several more cassette tapes in the same desk drawer. They also quickly find the secret door behind the bookcase, which further confirms to me that Frankenstein wasn't even trying. Come on, dude. If it takes less than a minute to find your secret door, then it really wasn't that secret. Meanwhile, at Frankenstein's house, he is actually home and spending time with Sonia for once. But even this small breakthrough is short-lived as Mosaic crashes their dinner and immediately starts attacking Sonia. From his gesturing, it looks like Mosaic wants Frankenstein to put Sonia's brain into his head, which is horrifying, but also, would that mean that Sonia's consciousness would be transferred to Mosaic's body? Would Sonia become Mosaic? That's kind of messed up. Thankfully, Frankenstein thinks so too, and he pulls away Mosaic long enough to let Sonia escape. Mosaic starts strangling Dr. Frankenstein, but then stops when Frankenstein threatens to destroy him. But then Mosaic thinks for a second and realizes he never really liked Frankenstein to begin with, so he starts attacking him and chasing him through the house again. Back at the lab, the police discover the empty bottle of Schwartz's serum, along with Schwartz's eyeless and decapitated head in a mini-fridge. They also find Fritz's body stuffed inside a cabinet. As Frankenstein is chased by Mosaic, he taunts him by saying that Mosaic's brain is already beginning to disintegrate, and it's only a matter of time before Mosaic dies on his own. Mosaic is all like, "Yeah, but I'll still outlive you, you doo-doo head," and murders him with some sort of large machete-like implement. I don't know what that was doing inside Frankenstein's kitchen, but it's way too late in the movie to be asking these kinds of questions. Carl and the police have realized that the monster must be at Frankenstein's house and are headed over. On the way, they run into Sonia, who collapses into Carl's arms. The police continue on ahead and discover Dr. Frankenstein's dead body in the kitchen. Later at the police station, everyone sits down and listens through Dr. Frankenstein's surgical notes, and they learn the truth about Mosaic.
How can anyone swear out an arrest warrant against someone who doesn't even have a name?
Well, first of all, his name is Mosaic, which you would know if you had paid attention to the tape. And second of all, you can just let the public know to watch out for someone matching Mosaic's description, right? Like, he's not exactly inconspicuous. He's a huge guy with a stitched-together face, and he wears a black trench coat and hat. Also, Carl decides that now is a great time to start arguing for the humanity of Mosaic.
Or maybe a man. Because he's not a monster. He's a poor human creature who's made up of pieces.
Like, I get it. I love all the philosophical questions posed by the Frankenstein story, but Carl, read the room. Mosaic is currently on a killing spree, And I think it's a little bit more important to be worrying about saving people's lives right now.
The real monster's that Dr. Frankenstein. Oh, sorry.
From the tapes, they've learned that they have somewhere between 36 and 48 hours before Mosaic's brain fully disintegrates and he dies. Unfortunately, they also realize that they have no idea where he's gone, and they can't do much more than sit around and wait for it to end and hope that he doesn't kill too many people.
48 hours without a smoke.
Thank you for your valuable input, Detective. Now is the part of the film where the plot progression leaves to take a smoke break, and we just get a bunch of back-to-back death scenes of unfortunate randos who come across Mosaic. First up, we have a stripper at a strip club. This is easily the sleaziest that the movie gets, since we get to watch her perform a extended striptease featuring full frontal nudity, and then when she goes back to her dressing room, still naked, Mosaic jumps out and strangles her to death. This is a textbook example of the kind of exploitation that would become even more infamous in the American slasher films of the 80s. But it's followed by my favorite scene in the movie, featuring my favorite character in the movie, the junkyard vagrant. This is, sincerely, the most entertaining scene of someone eating a sandwich you will ever see. But sadly, it is cut far too short when Mosaic attacks and crushes his head with part of a car engine. Then we cut to see a guy at a racetrack. He's there to watch the fast cars go vroom vroom. The cars are doing a very good job of this, so he leaves to go to the bathroom. Unfortunately for him, Mosaic is also using the bathroom, and he thinks this guy is a total nerd, so he crushes his head against a wall and leaves. Between these three death scenes, we get a bunch of shots of the police just driving around aimlessly. I guess they're hoping that Mosaic will just happen to wander by while they drive. Finally, some semblance of plot progression is reintroduced, and Sonia and Carl make plans to meet up for dinner. Meanwhile, a weirdly uncomfortable-looking couple is starting to get freaky in their car parked out in the woods. And wouldn't you know it, our favorite stitched-together walking corpse just happens to drop by, and he decides to murder the man by bashing his head against the car until he makes goofy pain noises. And meanwhile, his lady friend disappears into the woods, never to be seen again. The police somehow know about this murder, and they show up pretty quickly and start searching for Mosaic, but without any luck. At least we don't have to watch them drive around aimlessly anymore. Carl also decides to show up for no reason, but Schneider tells him to go home since there's nothing he can do to help here. Back at Carl's house, we see that Mosaic is hidden in the trunk of his car. Mosaic follows Carl into his house, and there attacks him and Sonia. Carl fights back, but his punches have little effect on Mosaic. The police receive a call from one of Carl's neighbors saying that they had seen a suspicious-looking man in a trench coat enter Carl's house. The police quickly rush over, realizing that this must be the monster. Mosaic is about to strangle Carl to death, but just then, his brain fully disintegrates. We get a great scene of Mosaic staggering around with blood dripping out of every opening in his face, and he starts spitting up all this bloody goop that I think is supposed to be his brain matter. It's over the top and gross, and I think it's a great way to kill off the monster. Carl and Sonia exit the house just as the police show up, and they tell Inspector Schneider that the monster is finally dead. The movie ends on a freeze frame with one of the detectives lighting Schneider's cigar. It feels like a pretty abrupt ending. My theory is that the screenwriters were just kind of sick of the movie at this point and decided, yeah, just end it there. Let's just get this out of the way. Frankenstein 80 is a flawed film. It's extremely sleazy and exploitative of all the women that appear in it. The acting is hammy at best, and the dub never quite matches up with the lip movements. But despite all these problems, there's something I find oddly charming about it. It's also quite an enigma. Like I said before, this movie was probably destined to be forgotten, if not for the work of the horror and exploitation fans, like the fine folks over at Cauldron Films, who created the restoration that I'm using for this video, and released a fantastic Blu-ray edition of the movie. This video has gotten me super excited for the next movie I'll be covering, which was also filmed in Italy, also stars Delilah De Lazzaro, and also features special effects created by Carlo Rimbaldi. But until then, thanks for watching, and if you made it this far in the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, stay weird.